Good afternoon. So we begin. This is the first tutorial day for the Introduction to Philosophy, so you're all very welcome. And this afternoon I'm going to be going through the writing of the assignment, or the essays. And we don't have a lot of time per essay. A lot of what I'm going to say is on the sort of approach you should take to writing essays in general, and with some detail on each of the topics and some guidance on how to approach the essays. One thing to keep in mind before you begin is you will need to consult the guidelines for writing assignments. That is, you will find them to the left of the page, the philosophy page, on the Priory's website. It's essential that you become familiar with this. It'll be helpful, in fact essential, for all of your academic writing throughout what courses you'll be doing. And it's good to learn to do this, to get all of the guidance correct from the very beginning, and then you can just sort of forget about it and keep going. The other thing is, on the first one of the links I put up to this document, this is from Lampeter University, Writing Philosophies, Essays and Exams. This is important as well. Do have a look at that. Particularly, it has a very good section on what plagiarism is and how to avoid plagiarism. So this is very important. That plagiarism is effectively passing off other people's ideas as your own, or passing off text written by someone else as your own. How to avoid this, whether it's done deliberately or inadvertently, you need to get references to everything you write, and keep clear track of references in footnotes. But to begin, the overall approach to writing an essay. Some of you will be familiar with writing essays. Some of you, of course, will be quite new to third level writing, or indeed you'll have come back to academics after some extended period of a break. Either way, it's the same things will hold whether you're familiar with academic writing or not. The most important thing is at all points keep the question in mind when you're writing. Keep the wording of the question in mind for everything you write. What I used to do when I was an undergraduate is I'd write it up on a piece of paper and stick it opposite my desk. The reason is, this is what it seems obvious, but this is what you're being marked upon. If you're asked about justice in Plato's Republic, then the best essay in the world that talks about Plato's life or Plato's influence or any other aspect of Plato is not relevant to answering the question. So no matter how well written it isn't an answer to the question. Therefore you can't get marks, just out of fairness. Everything you write should be in service of the question. Doesn't mean you need to take an overly narrow view that of what you're being asked. But everything you write must be in service of answering that question. And again, you have 2,000 words. It can seem like a lot. You'll get used to using those words wisely. So everything should answer the question that's being asked, not another question, no matter how good. So that's kind of the issue of relevance. Everything you write must be relevant. The other thing is, in terms of practicality, don't write the essay in one sitting. There is a tendency to read too much, and indeed to spend too much time reading. And you'll realise that you should have spent more time writing. So do what reading you need to do, and then spend time writing, because your analysis, or you're being marked not on how good reading you are, but on what you've written. And so you'll need to write the essay and then redraft it. Write a draft and then write it again. Tidy it up. Sometimes to begin with you might find it difficult to think, how am I going to write all these words? Once you have a structure in your head and then a structure written down on paper where you can order your thoughts on answering the question, then you'll see that the essay will gain some sort of structure. So again, don't read too much to the detriment of how much time you spend writing. You don't need to become an expert on any of these topics. You need to write an answer that has enough content to persuade the examiner that you know what you're talking about, that you understand the main issues. So it isn't a matter of trying to cram your head full of complications, and writing is what you want to do. So in terms of structure, your essay will look a lot like a chapter in a book to some degree. So structure is important, and structure involves writing in paragraphs that are united under a common theme. And you will have however many paragraphs you have in the entire essay under a common theme, and then it will be bookended on either side with an introduction and a conclusion. It's the old journalist joke used to be that you tell them what you're going to say, then you say it, and then you tell them what you've said. Sort of a joke, but not really too far-fetched. Thing to avoid when you're writing as well is paragraphs of 1 or 2 sentences. This gives an indication that you're hopping from point to point too much. So things should be united under a theme. It's important in writing, again, do have a look at the very, very good advice from Lampeter University that I've posted up on the first thing, Writing Philosophy. This will help you, if you read through that, it will help you in what it is to write clearly. It's very, very brief, but it'll save you time in the long run. So clarity in writing is important. You need to be clear about what you're saying. Part of that is not overcomplicating the way you write. Some academic writing looks very complicated. The stuff that's overly complicated simply means it's badly written. It should be clear to read, and avoiding overly complex sentences or unnecessarily florid writing. Sometimes you have students can come up with very, very flamboyant writing on various things. It doesn't answer the question. You need to be to the point. Style is a fine thing, provided it's used in service of answering the question, rather than writing overly florid material. Sometimes when you're writing essays like this, the students will, in the last paragraph, come up with single sentences, simply because they want to finish the essay. Come up with single sentences that are highly original, followed by another single sentence that's highly original, and all sorts of interesting ideas. And this comes from writing at one sitting, or writing in a sort of a single extended session. Sometimes when you read over this again, you should look back and think, this is a very good point. It should be taken back into the main part of the essay and perhaps expanded upon there, rather than you get these very interesting throwaway remarks in the conclusion. So yes, this is one of the reasons why you want to spread the writing over a piece of time, and indeed at the end of writing your draft, go through it again and tidy it up. You can avoid things like repetition or failures of style and of content such as vagueness, where you're not being precise enough, not being clear enough. As I said, at the end you'll have a conclusion where you tie together the various strands and explain that you've that you've answered the question, or kind of show that you've unified the essay by answering the question. There, as well, the introduction is as important as well as the conclusion. And for writing the introduction, it's typically best to write the introduction at the end, after you've written everything else. So when you're writing the essay, you can, by all means, write an introduction, but you'll probably want to come back and revisit it, write it again, simply because you'll then know, once your essay is finished, you'll know what you're going to say. So it's easier to come back in the conclusion and saying, in this essay I'm going to address the following issues. So rewrite the introduction as a good sort of rule of thumb. The other thing, coming back to footnotes and the writing guidelines, familiarise yourself with how to write a bibliography. That is the sources that you cite. Don't write an enormous bibliography of sources you don't cite. This is a general thing. If you use some source, put it in your bibliography. If you don't put it in the bibliography. It's not what it's for. And the structure of writing a bibliography, which is just the books that you've consulted, the bibliography is on its own last page of the essay. This is different from the references, footnotes. They go through the text. So every time you refer to a text, you need to give us a reference. And the method of doing the references is on pages 12 and 13 of the guidelines for writing assignments. So the general distinction is between books and articles. The names of books, the titles of books, are put into italics, always. The titles of articles are in inverted commas, in quotation marks. And you'll need the author, title, the place of publication of the publisher, and the year of publication. All of this is in, again, you'll see, this is page 12 and 13 of the guidelines. Get familiar with it, because this is a third level essay. You need to reference it properly. You need to give the references. When you're writing page numbers of a reference, if you have a single page, page 52, you'll write at the end of the reference P.52. If it's a range of pages, it's PP. 52 to 56, this kind of thing. You'll see this in any text publication. That's how citations work. So every time, write in the text when you have a citation, you're giving a reference. If it's a quotation of something and you find in the text, you need to put that in quotation marks, followed by the reference. If it's not a quotation, if it's a paraphrase, you don't need that, but you do still need to put the reference in. In general, don't fill the text with quotations or with overly long quotations. It's only 2,000 words in the end, so if you have a half a page of quotation, in a page, you simply can't be given the marks for it. You need to explain it in your own words. You need to show that you understand it rather than piecing together quotations. So, you see, some of it you'll find you'll find your feet eventually on writing essays if you're not used to it. Don't worry too much about coming out with fantastic essays at the beginning if you're not used to it. Over time you'll learn to write. You don't need to become familiar with academic writing overnight. I'm going to put a set of references online and some texts that will be of interest in these 4 essays to reliable sources. The thing very much not to do when you're writing an essay of this kind is Google the essay question and then go and chase up. This is not time well spent. And part of that is you want to avoid dodgy sources. The internet is full of dodgy sources. YouTube videos in general, you can have lots of interesting things. They're not a reliable source. They're not really a suitable source for academic writing, for third level essays. Amateur philosophy, likewise, try and avoid it. Really like the plague. Lots of enthusiastic and well-meaning people online write a lot of stuff that simply isn't reliable. It's not a decent source. Again, there's, as well as the textbook and different things I'll recommend, I will give you links to different reliable sources of notes and of the articles from the Stanford Encyclopedia and the like. These should be sufficient for the essays. Wikipedia is typically, outside the area of mathematics and science, is woefully inaccurate all over the place, so avoid Wikipedia. And again, follow the reading list. You'll be given as much extra material as you please. If you want any more, you can always contact me if you want any recommendations for specific texts or text for specific areas. Again, just stylistically, in writing essays, you want to avoid referring to yourself as the author or this type of Victorian stuff. It should be relatively informal. For an academic essay such as this in the area of philosophy, avoid putting bullet points, kind of strikeout points, charts, pictures, these kinds of things. This is a straightforward, all text essay, and again, the format that it's meant to be supplied in is Times New Roman. So if you can write it in whatever font you like but you need to, if you have it in a different font, you need to convert it to Times New Roman, highlight it all and convert it. This is what Times New Roman looks like. The reason for this is to keep the formats the same. Some fonts without the serif take longer to read. Some up to double the length of time to read as a nice font like Times New Roman. So it should be Times New Roman, 12-point size text with 1.5 line spacing. That's the sort of academic standard. Everybody's essay will end up being formatted the same, and as a consequence it'll be much easier to compare and contrast. Good. So, well, I'll get on talking about the different areas now. So the first of the 4 essays is, you can see we've sort of covered a lot of the issues in the first 2 lectures. So, given that philosophy does not make progress in the same way as the sciences, how might philosophy be a worthwhile pursuit? So particularly the quotations from the first and second lectures are relevant there. I'll also put a link to, if you want to see more of Bertrand Russell's final chapter of the value of philosophy, the final chapter of the problems of philosophy. That's all out of copyright now, and I'll put a link up to that. Particularly the last lecture, the first study day, I discussed this issue of what makes, sort of how philosophy progresses, or what makes philosophy move forward, and just how different it is from science. So you don't really need to discuss science much in this. So the question isn't about science or how science progresses, or the focus isn't science. It's somehow the focus is the contrast, is what makes philosophy a worthwhile pursuit. Is it somehow directionless, self-indulgent, and as a pursuit of something that goes nowhere? Is it abstract and speculative? Well, of course it is abstract and speculative, but that needn't be a criticism if it's taken correctly. It's possible for a subject to be useful and still be speculative and abstract. And of course philosophy also has in addition to the highly speculative metaphysics and the like, it has more practical parts to it, such as ethics, philosophy of art, aesthetics, and philosophy of politics, which is strictly speaking a branch of ethics. It's the ethics of society. And you know, there are areas such as logic as well, which is, as with mathematics, philosophy is a priori, meaning prior to empirical or evidential kind of information gathering. So it's not like science in this way. It is a priori, though it deals with evidence in the world as well. So it is a priori speculative, but it's not pure guesswork. And so again, we can talk about perceptual objects and non-perceptual objects like numbers and the like. Speculative, but involving argumentation, not just mere guesswork or fanciful thinking. Because philosophy deals, if it is a worthwhile pursuit, it deals with matters of truth. It deals with the correspondence between our thinking and reality. We're trying to somehow get at reality and get reality right. So these are the critical aspects of philosophy. There are important. That a philosophy arrives at its conclusions, or attempts to arrive at its conclusions via argumentation. And indeed, the philosophical theories get refined by the use of counterexamples, which counterexample will show that a theory you need to go back to the drawing board in some way. It needs to be reworked because it results in a contradiction. The theory involves something, it's self-undermining in some way. So, and we saw with the Gettier example of knowledge and justified true belief the other day. This is all relevant to this question. So philosophy, in another way, we don't need to persuade our opponents that we're right. We need somehow to persuade ourselves that our opponents' arguments don't have any bearing upon us. So simply because there's a disagreement, it doesn't mean that we need to abandon the idea that there can be truth in philosophy, or that philosophy can make advances. So philosophy does deal with what is not directly available to the senses. We can't get an answer to whether I'm the same person as I was when I was 5 years old through analysis of either the senses or the empirical world. These are issues of philosophical rather than scientific interest. And likewise, areas such as ethics, the questions of the existence of ethical values or the existence of rights. No one, I think, suspects that these are objects that are studied by physics, or they're not chemical elements, but like philosophy seems to deal with things that are not the objects of scientific research or scientific theories. And yet these apparently abstract things, such as human morality, the existence of values, the existence of human rights, what makes an action right or wrong, what role motivation has in ethics and the like. These are abstract in this way, but they're also highly practical. They've got practical, indeed, kind of essential practical application in daily human life. And there are these, we can then have these questions such as, is morality something that has a rational foundation, or perhaps does morality have an emotional foundation, or a mixture of the both? Somehow, certainly, our reactions to immorality are emotional reactions, rather than forming some sort of an equation on paper to see that something's right and wrong. The politician will say, well, this is an emotional reaction, as if that's a criticism. Of course, ethical reactions are emotional reactions. There is no equation for morality. So, these kinds of concerns when thinking about how philosophy progresses, it's not a surprise that philosophy will operate very differently to the sciences, simply because the subject matter is distinct. It's not, they don't overlap. It's not that sciences will come in and solve all the philosophical questions. Science solves scientific questions. There's a strong demarcation between the scientific and the philosophical. So I think there are plenty of things in the previous lectures that mention Bertrand Russell and the like, and how he thought philosophy was useful, how it benefits our ways of thinking, to undermine the sort of intellectual arrogance. And he thought a kind of ill-founded arrogance, where we're certain of what we believe, that this type of, if you're certain of what you believe without having reason to be certain about it, then this is a sort of a dangerous trait in thinking. And to some extent the role of philosophy is to make us less certain of these things, and reduce this, while increasing our sort of interest in philosophical topics, to reduce our certainty, at least in line with how certain we ought to be. And as I mentioned last time, Anthony Kenny and Anthony Grayling have their own comments as well on philosophy and how the minor ways that it might make progress. As Kenny says, philosophy can, where it can't solve problems, can clarify them and make distinctions to somehow give us options as to what the right answers might be. While Kenny at least admits that he believes that there are no certain answers in philosophy at all, but we can say that some answers are preferable to others, and some theories have to be put into the bin. So the part of this essay as well will involve whether it can involve whether philosophical problems are real problems at all. Again, I discussed this in the last lecture. All of that material will be relevant. One of the reasons that we require that the questions be good questions is that, unlike poetry and music and the like, philosophy is, at least on the face of it, aimed towards the truth. It looks as though we're asking questions about how the world is in reality, independently of how we happen to think about it. This means that we need to have access to the world. Philosophy is aimed towards getting things right about the world. So, if philosophical questions are good questions, and philosophy can make kind of inroads into addressing these questions, then philosophy is a viable discipline. If philosophical problems if they're dodgy, or if there's no such thing as philosophical problem, as Wittgenstein thought, or if we've simply no means at all of arguing towards some rational conclusion about these problems, then philosophy looks as though it might not be a viable discipline. That the sort of anti-scientific or the anti-philosophical views of the positivists in the early and mid 20th centuries might be onto something, and that the only real questions, the only sensible questions, are scientific questions. Again, this is probably most philosophers now think that philosophical questions are realistic, and that limiting all truth and falsity to science is simply making a mistake, and that there's no non-circular reason for supposing that that's true. It's simply to insist that the only truths are scientific truths. There's no scientific reason for believing this. It simply has to be held as a type of dogma of some sort. Good. Right. I think we should move on before too long, before we run out of time. But I will say that the Gettier question about justified true belief, and the idea of counterexamples and the like, that these are important in thinking about this question. And again, keep the eye. How might philosophy be a worthwhile pursuit? So that what you're really asking is equivalent to saying, is philosophy simply some either redundant or fanciful or purely abstract guesswork, or is there something to it? So this is, we'll have plenty of material in this. Incidentally, I'm going to put up some of these sorts of notes that I've got here. I will put up kind of structured points of them, so that you don't have to be too frantic in taking notes during this lecture. You can always watch it back, of course, but I will put up some material online of my own sort of notes, just to try and keep things a little clear. So, on to the second essay. What makes the pre-Socratic philosophers important in the history of philosophy? So, the pre-Socratics were, of course, the first philosophers in the Western world. And the question here is, what's distinctive about this new way of thinking? What makes it important? What makes it philosophical, interestingly enough, as well? It definitely, something new was happening when the pre-Socratics started doing what they did. And part of it was, as we'll see when we're discussing this, part of it is that they looked for a naturalistic explanation, meaning an explanation that involves the things around us in the world, rather than immediately for a supernatural one. They were the first scientists, as well as the first, speculative scientists, I would say. They were interested in what we call scientific questions. They definitely didn't have what you call a scientific method. They were speculative, but they sought a naturalistic explanation. That's an explanation that doesn't go outside time and space, that the world that we inhabit. Of course, they're called pre-Socratics, despite some of them being contemporary with Socrates. They're called pre-Socratic because their interests are pre-Socratic, rather than that they're temporally before Socrates. Socrates was primarily interested in ethics and ethical concerns. He had very little interest in the problems about the physical world, or about the origin of the universe, the like, or the makeup of the universe. He was concerned with ethics. So the pre-Socratics are pre-Socratic in that sense, not just temporally, but that they looked for these scientific accounts, or these naturalistic accounts, rather than being overly interested in ethics, as though some of them made some inroads into ethics, but primarily we'll see that they're interested in the makeup of the world, what the world is made of, interested in the origins of the world, the origins of the different species of animals, interested in questions of whether there are gods and the like, as well. So one of the major themes of the pre-Socratics was the distinction between appearance and reality. That somehow the world appears to be a particular way, but in reality there's a different picture. There's a kind of an unseen world of structures that give rise to the appearances that appear to us. So in Heraclitus, kind of to jump into the middle of the pre-Socratics, he believed that the world was in a state of flux, that the observable world had lots of somehow a constant movement, but also that the world also displayed an apparent order, that the opposites that appeared in the world were unified in some sense. I'm going to put up some of the kind of major fragments of Heraclitus as well. They're kind of just interesting to use as examples if you're writing this essay. So Heraclitus called this the unity, his account of how the world hung together. He called logos. Logos simply means lots of things, means word. In Greek has lots of meanings, but in this case it means an account, or kind of a unifying account of how the world works. And so his account was the world is in a state of flux, but it hangs together the opposites unify. So in one of the famously quoted pieces, it's probably misquoted, that where Heraclitus says you can't step in the same river twice. But there's another fragment, which is probably the authentic one, where he says, when you step into the same river, ever different waters flow. So this river is in constant motion, and the reason I'm stepping in the same river is the waters are constantly changing. That's what makes something a river. These kinds of opposites hanging together. So this is the logos, and this is how he thinks the world hangs together. It's in Heraclitus. So you've probably got the first person that looks like one of the later Greek metaphysicians. He's got a sort of an early form of metaphysics of how the world really hangs together. Parmenides, his successor, has probably the greatest possible distinction between appearance and reality. He thought that all of this world around us, all the different things, motion, change, things coming to be and going out of being, all of this is an illusion. In reality, there's simply being. No distinctions, no two different beings, no temporal changes, no alteration, no movement. And he thinks that being is conceivable, non-being is not conceivable, can't be thought about. And his arguments are very difficult to refute in a strange way. And Parmenides is an interesting example of how you can start with seemingly perfectly reasonable starting points in Parmenides and move through an argument to what seems to be a completely absurd conclusion. But there's an argument that gets him there. That I'll put a link up to Michael Cohen. I've put up Michael Cohen's notes, his lecture notes on Greek philosophy, on ancient Greek philosophy. Parmenides Part 2 is the one that's relevant to you. It's a few pages and it's worth having a look at, even if you're not doing the essay, if you're interested in pre-Socratics. Once you get the essay out of the way, it might be interesting to look at. And simply because he gives a very clear account of how the argument works. Non-being is, or rather being is, non-being is not. Nothing can come, something can't become nothing, nothing can't become something. And as a consequence, he goes through an argument that ends up saying nothing can change. You can't have movement, you can't have change. Highly revisionary account of the world, that everything around us is simply illusion, and what's real is a structureless, permanent, single being, entity. No change, no coming to be, no going out of being, nothing. So this is his distinguishing truth from seeming, if you like. Is the most extreme form of distinction between appearance and reality you can get. One of the reasons he thinks that movement is impossible, I take this tail piece and move it over here. He thinks, well, this is impossible because that involves being and then void, empty space. And he thinks that void, because void is non-being, void can't be real. So non-being can't have being. Again, very simple arguments and very difficult to argue against. This kind of radical account. It's interesting, of course, that as with Berkeley believing that matter didn't exist, Parmenides simply went where he thought the argument took him. He went and apparently believed this extreme conclusion because he thought that was the correct conclusion of an argument. There are the sophists who argued, effectively using fraudulent logic. They argued for absurd conclusions and absurd consequences of things, but Parmenides is not a sophist. Parmenides thought that this was the correct view, and it's difficult to refute in a way. Plato, we'll see when we look at the forms. Plato gives a sort of solution to Parmenides, But the other people who give a solution is the atomists, or the atomists. And they're not mentioned greatly in the text itself, but they're worth having a little look at. I'll put up a link to the parts of the atomists that are worthwhile. Again, Mark Cohen's notes are excellent on the atomists, and the Stanford Encyclopedia. You don't need to read a massive amount, but that's enough to get you a good idea. So what the atomists thought is that their solution is that the world is made up of tiny, tiny little particles. And the tiny particles clump together and make big objects. So they had a distinction between appearance and reality as well. It turns out that the atoms are tiny, they don't have colour, they don't, because we can't see them, so they don't have colours. When they clump together, then they have observable features that we can observe. So the atomists think that on the small level there's no colour. This is probably correct. Its colour is interaction with, you know, bigger parts of matter, ultimately made up of atoms. And all of the observable things, all of the things that we can observe with the senses, are appearances. In reality, they don't have these properties at all. The other thing that they've had that solves the problem of Parmenides saying that if we believe that being is and non-being is not, we're moved into this view that there can only be one being, no change, no movement, no generation, no destruction. Just one unitary, monistic being that never changes. The atomists get out of this conclusion by saying being is, that's the atoms, they're real, but also non-being is. The void is also real. So you have atoms and void. Void in their case just meaning empty space. So the being is, atoms are real. Non-being, that's what the void, they call the void also is. And that's why you can get things breaking apart, forming new things, you can get creation, you can get change, movement. All of these things become possible to account for if you believe that as well as atoms, there is void. As well as being, non-being is also real. Ingenious and pretty clever. The atomists, incidentally, had that account of, was it Democritus, I think, who had an account of how we can smell bread from a bakery. And he said, well, what happens is the little particles of bread float through the void, float through the air, go up my nose and touch my brain. And I smell bread, and it smells like bread because the groups of atoms have a particular shape, and anything with this shape will smell like bread. It turns out all of that was complete speculation, very clever speculation, because all of that is pretty much true. The reason that cyanide smells like bitter almonds is that structurally they have the same kind of shape. You know, different materials, but the shape is the same, so that the human body is kind of tricked into thinking that it's the same chemical. You know, pure speculation, but simply brilliant. So probably just to go back to say something about Heraclitus, that his most famous fragment, you can't step in the same river twice, that this is almost certainly the view of Cratylus. C-R-A-T-A-L-U-S. So Cratylus was a student of Heraclitus and the teacher of Plato. And so Plato probably got the idea that flux is really what the central philosophy of Heraclitus was, but it wasn't. It was the central philosophy of Cratylus. That the world is. Cratylus said you can't even step in the same river once. So he had this kind of radical flux as an idea. Whereas in Heraclitus, it's the unity. It's this logos, the unity of opposites that gives a kind of an account of how the world hangs together with all this flux around. So So Heraclitus was really interested in there how the world displayed order. You know, how the world is ordered. One of the things that's in thinking about the importance of the pre-Socratics is, of course, the Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes, the Milesians, it's called. They were interested in the kind of origins of the principle behind all the things that we see, which is mentioned in the text. It's they call it effectively the fundamental principle, arche. The arche is the principle behind things. So they have the question of the one and the many. So we have a world that has all kinds of appearances, all kinds of things around it, and yet they believed that there are fundamental elements of which the world is made up. Thales thought that the entire world was made up of water. That fundamentally, once you break everything down, water is the fundamental element. And you had others that had more complex systems. You find with the principle of apeiron, the formless or the boundless, in Anaximander, is it? That he thought that if there were all these different elements that were that things are fundamentally made up of, that one of them would come to dominate, and you'd end up with no complexity at all. So he thought that the fundamental element has to be some kind of formless entity. Again, primarily this was a kind of extreme speculation in a great way, but also we know now that the world is made up of a rather large number of fundamental chemical elements. So they were looking for something like this. You also had in the pre-Socratics an important distinction that you get in Xenophanes, which begins with a Z. Xenophanes had a view that the world is difficult to understand, and again this kind of goes against the kind of temple religions of the time, where they have an account for everything. It's a religious account. It's not just speculative, but it's not based on reasoning of any kind. It's based simply on either tradition or making it up, which is the two possibilities. And Anaximander said some things are simple to know, some things are take a lot of work to know, and some things we might not be able to know at all. Again, this seems sort of obvious to us. It's not remotely obvious to the ancient Greeks. This is an advance in our thinking, and it's the type of attitude that the pre-Socratics had. Is that there are some kind of things at the edges of our knowledge that we might never be able to be, something we can't be certain about. Sometimes we might not be able to know at all. It was also Xenophanes that thought that the gods of ancient Greece were just a bit too much like these grumpy kings that they used to have, and said that, well, if horses had gods, then they'd have 4 legs and long faces. He wasn't overly impressed with this type of kind of revealed religion that you got in Greece. Indeed, that's probably the case with Aristotle as well. I mean, once we go later, Aristotle had precious little time for revealed religion of the Greek variety or of any kind. He thought that reason was the way to get to any type of knowledge. So, one of the things to remember when writing this, because you're answering the question, what makes the pre-Socratic philosophers important in the history of philosophy? What you're being asked there is for a kind of an explanation of what makes them interesting. What is new about this way of thinking? What's philosophical about it? What's scientific? And what's just important about this new way of thinking and this new way of questioning? What we don't want is a list of things they reckoned. This is not an answer to the question. You will need to mention the different pre-Socratics. I'm going to put notes up to give a bit more detail, because I'm sort of interested not in the not in all of the ins and outs of their different theories here, but in simply what makes it interesting and what you're meant to be discussing in the question. You will need examples, of course, so I'll put some stuff online, because we don't have an enormous amount of time. So, yes, the thing that's important here is don't give a list of things they reckoned. Thales thought this, a list, and worst, if you're starting to think of, will I put a table of things they reckoned? This is to miss the point. You'll need to discuss the things that they thought, their own theories, their distinctions between the appearance and reality, the arche that different ones had, what they thought was the fundamental principle, the fundamental kind of elemental basis of the world. These things you will discuss, but you're not asked for a list of things pre-Socratic philosophers reckoned or what they thought. This all had to be put into a form where you're answering this question about their sort of innovations. Right, I better plough along since time is short. So, next essay. Why did Socrates think it's so important to find correct definitions of moral terms? So, what you'll find here in the text is one of the most important. I'm going to put up an article, in fact, on this as well, from one of the companions to Socrates. What's important here is Socrates' moral thinking. And so there's a distinction, it's mentioned in the text, I'll say it again, it can't be said enough. The early texts of Plato are called the Socratic dialogues because the chances are they are, if not Socrates' actual words, definitely Socrates' actual way of doing philosophy, his interest. And in the middle and late dialogues of Plato, Socrates is really a character. He's a character for Plato's thoughts and ideas, usually. That's just broadly so. So he's not the historical Socrates. So in the Republic, we can say safely, Plato thought, even though Socrates is the character. In the early dialogues, the Socratic dialogues, this is Socrates' views that Plato has written down, or at least his way of doing philosophy. And how Socrates did things is he wanted to get definitions of moral terms. So he went and asked people. Famously, the oracle at Delphi said that Socrates was the wisest man in Athens. And Socrates thought, but I don't know anything. I don't claim to any knowledge. How could I be the wisest man? And so he went around asking the wisest men, or the people he thought were wise, asking them important moral questions. What is justice? What is beauty? What is holiness or piety? Asking for these sort of moral terms. And they didn't know, but they thought they knew. So this is where Socrates thought, well, he is the wisest because he knows that he doesn't know, whereas the other ones don't know, but are under the illusion that they do. This is the... again, this isn't him at his ironic best. This is simply, he thought, straightforwardly true. So what Socrates did in his dialogues was to ask people who were apparently in the know. You ask a judge, say, what is justice? And the judge tries to give you an answer. Ask a priest, what is piety? And this is what Socrates' approach was, to find people who took themselves to be experts and try and find out these terms. It turns out, through his dialectic, this Elenchus, call it, the Socratic dialogue, he can show that the definitions that people gave him were contradicted to their own thoughts. So it's not that he went around, barging in and telling people what to think. It's that he could show through his dialogues that your theory is self-undermining, that it is incompatible with something else that you think. The very first part of Plato's Republic is Socratic in nature. It might not be a Socratic dialogue, but it is Socratic in nature. In its structure, it's asking about what justice is in reality, and so there you have a definition of an offered definition of justice. Justice is restoring what is borrowed, or something like this. And Socrates asks, well, what if you lent a friend of yours a knife, and your friend then went insane? Would it be just to return the knife to them? I said, well, no. Well, quite right. That means that justice isn't returning what is borrowed. It's something else. So it's a counterexample, and this is how the Socratic dialogues build. They try and find a definition. The interlocutor, the person debating or discussing with Socrates, offers a definition, and then Socrates will question the definition and will show that it isn't adequate, and then tries to refine it, and so on. Typically, the Socratic dialogues end in what's called aporia. A-P-O-R-I-A. Aporia simply means a kind of a philosophical puzzlement. They start with an aporia and they end in aporia. But a slightly better one, we hope. They end in a better place, but with a state of puzzlement. Some sort of philosophical puzzlement. But we've found out that at least we know what justice is not, or the like, or what piety is not. One of the dialogues that does really come to some sort of conclusion is the Euthyphro, which is mentioned in the text. Euthyphro was a priest, and he was asked, so what is piety, or kind of goodness, we might think? And the question was, it became this question: is what is pious because it is loved by the gods, or do the gods love it because it is pious? We can switch to the term goodness, it'll make it a little easier. Is what is good because it's loved by the gods, or do the gods love it because it is good? Socrates concluded, and again this sort of discussion ends up recurring in the later Middle Ages as to what makes something good. Is it that it's sanctioned by God, or is something moral not independently, but is it not subject to the will of God? Is it simply good in itself? So, in this case, Socrates ended up with the conclusion that what is good is loved by the gods because it is good, not the other way around. It doesn't become good by being appreciated by the gods. It is loved by the gods because it is good. So you have a rare instance of a kind of conclusion there. But the question of the essay is why? Again, this is a sort of a broader topic than might appear in the title, because it revolves around the different definitions, the way he does dialectic, that's important as well for this essay, and indeed why he fell foul of the authorities to some degree, not his religious ideas, but how this type of philosophy might undermine authority in the sort of the way that, in a sort of a even stronger way than the pre-Socratics undermined received views. In Socrates' case, he undermined authority. But why was he looking for definitions in the first place? The reason is his moral psychology. He thought that if anyone acts immorally, it's because they lack knowledge of some kind. His idea was, if I know what it is to be just, I will act justly. He thought that people who act unjustly do so because they've got an incorrect idea of what it is to be just. This looks very naive in a way, but it's worthwhile trying to take it a little bit seriously to see where he's going with it. Socrates denied what we call akrasia. It's mentioned in the text, A-K-R-A-S-I-A, usually A-C. But akrasia is the Greek for a weakness of the will. So it means that people who know something is the right thing to do, and they do the opposite anyway because they're weak-willed. So the heroin addict can know that if they keep taking heroin, they'll die, but they choose the lesser good because of weakness of the will. Socrates thought that was impossible. He thought that there's an extent to which we can sort of be charitable here. Anything that moves my will to do anything is because I think there's some good. The reason I make tea is I want tea. The reason I switch the kettle on is I want to make tea. Everything that I do is directed towards something I think is good. So if we sort of take that, seems to be obvious enough. Socrates just thought that was always the case, that we always act what we think is the best thing to do. And if we're acting wrong, then it's because we have wrong definitions. So what is it to have the right definition? It's to get, for something to be good, that my definition will include everything good, and it will exclude everything not good. That's a correct definition, perfect definition. And so when Socrates is debating with people, he shows either that their definition contains stuff they don't want in it, or that it excludes things they do want in it. Now so their definitions are inadequate. But why do we want a proper definition? You can see with his moral psychology, denies weakness of the will. His moral psychology is, if I had a correct definition of some moral term, I would never act incorrectly. I'd always have a template to compare it to somehow, some kind of perfect template, and then I would act morally. So one of the things you find in the dialogues is lists. You get it in the beginning of Republic too, with a list of just things, or just beings, just people, just actions. The important thing of what makes a list inadequate is precisely why something is on the list. If I have a list of all the good things, how could I add to the list? How could I be wrong about the list? It's circular. You need a means, even an entire list of things. I wouldn't be able to identify any new instance of good. I've no idea why I'd be right or wrong about it. And it sort of shows that it's the same way with laws. When you get, I was debating with a politician from Ireland one time who said we don't need an idea of morality, we've got the laws. Well, if that were the case, then you'd never overturn a law because laws are automatically good. You'd never bring in a new law because why would you? On what principle? If goodness is simply what the laws are, then you'd never change a law, bring in a new law. It's circular. The reason that we're able to discuss what makes a law good or bad is that we have, independently of that, we have concepts of good and bad. Indeed, in the dialogue Crito, C-R-I-T-O, in Crito, Plato asks this, or the Socratic dialogue. So Socrates asks again, what makes makes a law right, and this is important. So the idea is that you have a template. A correct definition is a template for acting morally, acting right, and it's not only that if I have the correct definition that I could act morally. Socrates' moral psychology is such that if I had the correct definition, I would infallibly act morally. And this is why he took it so seriously, that we needed these definitions. What makes it dangerous for Socrates, and ultimately what got him killed, was that what he ended up doing by going around and asking a judge, say, what is justice, and it turns out the judge doesn't know, is he's shown that these people are not qualified for the jobs that they have. He thought you needed to have knowledge to be moral, and these people who are in positions of authority, particularly of kind of coercive power, who can control people with the law and the like, these people ought to know, right from wrong. They ought to know, on his psychology, they ought to know definitions of these essential terms in morality. If they didn't know them, if a judge, for instance, doesn't know what justice is, you've demonstrated in public that the judge is not up to the job. He's unqualified. and showing politicians that they're not up to the job is dangerous. The politicians in Ireland give us a head start, of course, but in Socrates' case, this was what had undermined the authority of the state. All of these people who are apparently in a position to know what's right and wrong, and what we ought to do, how we should act, what the law should be, were demonstrated that they showed themselves not to be qualified in doing this. So this is kind of relevant to the essay as well, how this type of questioning and how the demand for definitions, along with this moral psychology, will somehow undermine authority. But again, if Socrates is correct, then these people have assumed an authority they're not up to. They're not qualified for it. Judges should know what's right and wrong. Judges should know what justice is. And of course, even now, Socrates would undoubtedly ask these heavy philosophical questions. If a judge even today doesn't know right from wrong, why should I obey the judge? It turns out there's a lot of as in Socrates' day, a lot of the authority that people assume is simply hanging by a thread. If it's questioned too deeply, it will undermine itself. So, again, I'll put up some more stuff on that because we are running out of time. So you can see that there's a similar sort of questioning going on when we look at Plato in the Republic. So this is the question I have here. It's sort of involved. You can see the question on Plato. The reason I've made it sort of involved is to direct you in a particular way to answering a question about the central themes of the Republic. So here's the question: describe Plato's theory of justice in the state and justice in the soul. And how does justice relate to some of the minor themes in the Republic? So, what I could have asked is discuss the major themes in the Republic. But what I'm doing here is pointing out the really major theme in the Republic is justice in the soul and justice in the state, because they're analogous in Plato's view. And then there's some of the minor points is there are other elements in other lesser themes. How do they relate to justice? So typically, the whole dialogue starts out asking what justice is, and again you get an idea of lists, inadequate definitions, and then he goes on to give an account of first of all the state and then the soul. And so, what makes a just state just? Plato thought that a just state is ruled by people who, again, almost on a Socratic way, a just state is ruled by people who know what justice is. People with knowledge. And so his idea was that there are three different stratas in society. There are the guardians, the rulers, the ruling people. There are auxiliaries. They're the sort of law enforcement and the protectors of the state. And then there are the general workers, the people who do all of the work that makes the state thrive and function, that feeds everyone, the sort of essential people to the state. And if the state is acting, if the state were unjust, then either the workers would be in charge or the auxiliaries would be in charge. His at the end of the Republic, he has this thing saying democracy is the worst type of government because it has people who aren't in the know, people who lack knowledge ruling. Aristotle probably had it. In a way, is less studied because it's a bit more boring. Aristotle's politics. Aristotle's politics said yes, democracies might be terrible, but it is the best. It is the best possible form of government. So there's different sort of things to be said in what to take seriously about Plato's theory and what's so interesting about his views on justice. But first of all, we'll have a look at the analogy. So he thinks that the just state and the just person are structurally similar. The just person, meaning the person who's kind of moral or just in this way. Plato thinks there are three parts to the soul: the intellect, and the spirited part of the soul that corresponds to the auxiliaries, to the army, and then there's the appetite, which corresponds to the workers. So the intellective part of the soul, the spiritive part, and the appetitive part, or the appetite. These are not, somehow aspects or ways of thinking about the soul. On Plato's view, there are three completely distinct parts of the soul. The soul is what they say tripartite. The soul has three parts. All of them have to exist together. They're distinct, but necessarily related. They're necessarily linked. So you've got this distinction that corresponds to real distinction within the soul. On his view, a soul that is just will have the intellect in charge. The intellect will keep the other two parts of the soul in check. Effectively, you don't get ruled by either your appetites or your passions or the spirit. The intellect should govern over. And once you have this, you have a chance of having a good, just person. Likewise, in society, you'll have the guardians being in charge of the well-ordered state. Just sort of to get out of the way that there's a common and kind of obviously wrong interpretation of Plato that shows that he's some kind of despot, or that he wants some kind of tyranny of philosophers. The guardians, of course, in his view, will be philosopher kings, and philosophers here meaning people who love wisdom. And specifically, one of the other themes of the Republic is knowledge of forms. I'll put notes up about that because it's going to be it'll be too rushed to do it today properly. Though we can talk about it in the questions as well. But so people who know what justice really is, in Plato's part in the middle of this dialogue, the middle of Republic, he shows that it's the form. Once you know what the form of justice is, okay, very, very unlike Socrates here, because he believes there's a metaphysical reality out there that we've got access to. These are the forms. And so when I know what the form is, the form of anything, then I have real knowledge. He thinks the objects around us in this world are just too flimsy. They keep displaying contradictory features, temporary features. They go out of existence and come into existence. They're just a bit too metaphysically flimsy to be objects of knowledge. So in order to know what justice is, it involves knowing the form of justice. And how justice relates to things in this world is anything just in this world will participate in the form of justice. Anything beautiful will participate in the form of beauty. It turns out that all of the essences that anything in the world has, they have purely in virtue of participating in the forms. Of themselves, it's as if they're nothing at all. The forms give everything this aspect. But it also means that the forms are objects of knowledge, kind of exemplars of things, and they're the pure objects of knowledge. So, for someone to know what justice is, means to know the forms. The philosophers are the ones who know what the forms are. They study precisely in order to become familiar with the forms. So the idea of a philosophy tyranny, as Karl Popper thought, that Plato wanted to take all the philosophers out of the academy and take over the state. This isn't right, and the following little thought will show you why that can't be right. Let's imagine that a non-philosopher knew the forms, knew what the form of justice was, for instance. Would that non-philosopher be able to be a guardian in Plato's state? It's a bit of a trick question, because if a non-philosopher knows the forms, that makes them a philosopher. The philosopher, the lover of wisdom, is someone who knows what the forms are on Plato's view. So simply your knowledge is what puts you in a position of being able to be a guardian. It's not some some sort of fixed sort of stratus in society. Knowledge is what gets you there. So there is this strict demarcation of things within society, and Plato had an idea of that there are certain metals in the soul, as they call them, that people have different natural dispositions that will lead them to be better at certain things. Some people have got a natural disposition to mathematics. As Russell said, that there's, Plato realised it makes no more sense to have hereditary rulers than it does have to have hereditary mathematicians or hereditary physicists. That's not how knowledge works. So there's no problem at all with the child of a farm worker or something becoming one of these great philosopher kings. It's simply to do with the education. In the Republic itself, again, one of the lesser themes is education. He thought that everyone, men and women of all of the three types of people in the society, should all have the same education up to the age of 18, I think it was, and then they can specialise. Philosophers will go and study, first of all, mathematics and geometry and the like, and then study philosophy to come to know the forms. So yes, so as soon as you are someone who knows what the forms are, knows what justice is, then automatically that makes you a philosopher. So it isn't a case of this type of tyranny. Likewise, there's some mention. There's a good article in the Stanford Encyclopedia on ethics and politics in the Republic. There's another one on metaphysics in the Middle Dialogues. I'll link you to both of them, and you can see different sections. They're very long articles. You don't need to read it all, but the different sections you can pick and choose and have a look at. One of the themes that you find, which is related to justice, the minor themes, is Plato's supposed feminism. So it's not quite the sophisticated feminism of the 19th and 20th centuries, but he did say that only in matters of strength, of physical strength, are women inferior to men. In the terms of intellect and everything else, he thought that women are absolutely as qualified to rule as any men. Sadly, it was Aristotle's view that dominated the Christian West in the Middle Ages rather than Plato's. Plato's view got rather ignored. Elsewhere, in fact, where there was a view that because of hormones or something that women are naturally less rational than men, Plato, on the contrary, said men are governed by anger to such an extent that it makes them significantly less rational than women. So he sort of thought that this was that this supposed idea of women being less rational is a nonsense. And Plato sort of slightly despaired that the idea of humans as Homo sapiens, as rational men, that he often called humans featherless bipeds instead, because he wasn't convinced that human beings were rational. So the analogy, again, in this essay, you want to bring out the analogy between the tripartite soul and the tripartite state. Again, we might critique the idea that the state need not have three distinct, three classes and only three classes that are distinct and have that ordering. So, to what extent is the dialogue really about politics? There are some people who say the whole thing is about justice in the soul, but it's unlikely that that's really the case, simply because of the some of the other themes, such as education and the idea that child rearing will be done in common. That you have this control over reproduction and the like, which that does sound a bit towards the kind of Pol Pot spectrum, away from the liberal view of Plato. But again, it's not really obvious how this was meant to be taken. It's supposedly all of these things are to make society just and to make the person just, but it's unlikely that it's simply all a metaphor for the just person. it looks as though there is genuine political element as well. If you look at some of the seemingly peculiar things in Plato, is he didn't have much time for rhetoric and for art. So rhetoric is the art of persuasion, and fine speaking and fine persuasion, and young men in Athens used to learn to speak and argue and really engage in what you might think of the sort of lawyer type of reasoning or debating, this type of stuff, where the aim isn't truth. The aim is to persuade your opponent, regardless of the truth. It's to persuade your opponent that you're correct. And what's wrong with this is, on Plato's view, that even if you're right, even if someone is speaking the truth, rhetoric will make them believe the truth for the wrong reasons. They'll believe it because it's being said beautifully. And of course we can know that politically some very fine speakers have convinced people of some very, very bad things, because truth wasn't the concern, it was the beauty of how something was presented. So in Plato's view, even if it's the truth that's being presented using this rhetoric, people are believing it for the wrong reasons, so it's dangerous in that way. And in art, Plato was opposed to kind of art and poetry, in one way because of the forms. So his idea of the things in the world around us are copies of the forms. The forms participate in, or rather the objects in this world participate in the forms by being bad copies of the forms. So the incomplete similarity, we might think. So a beautiful sunset participates in the form, the beautiful, or the form of beauty. The beautiful piece of music participates in the form of beauty, meaning that it's a poor copy of the form of beauty, in the way that Anthony Kenny was talking about the form of dog. They said the form of the dog is the dog, the whole dog, and nothing but the dog. That somehow even dogs are poor copies of the form of dogginess, And in this view, someone doing art, making a picture or a sculpture, they're making a copy of what is a copy of the form, which is, Plato seems to think, is redundant, it's silly, and he didn't like it. And beautiful poetry and theatre and the like, he thought was dangerous because it deceives people, because it's, as with rhetoric, it makes people feel things that don't correspond to reality, and he thought that this type of fanciful thinking is dangerous and it leads to being unjust. Aristotle had a far different view. He thought that watching tragedy and comedy and the like is cathartic. It will make us experience emotions based upon a fictional scenario, but that it'll benefit us emotionally. So he didn't have such a bleak view. But even in this, it was the Plato, when thinking about art and why we might want to dispense with art and poetry, it was really justice that he was thinking about in the end. Still, that everything revolves around the discussion of a just state. When it comes to things like making everyone shoulder the burden of childcare and having children brought up in common, again, these are fanciful notions in a sense. It does happen in some societies, but I think the notion to take with this, as with the notions of education, is that this was purely speculative, but that he always had some reasoning in favour of this being linked to justice. Again, this is a big dialogue here. Again, as with all the essays, it's very important in this instance. If you want to do this essay, then look at the reading list that I post and the articles that I posted, because that will give you all the best stuff. Do not Google the question and expect to get anything like the resources you need to do an actual, university. But this is really a university essay. In the case of Socrates and Plato, you need to know where your quotations come from, and that means getting them from either an article or from the text itself, from the Euthyphro, from the Apology, from Republic. Do not look at texts of quotations, or sites with quotations of wise things Socrates said. I did have several years ago an essay where every single quotation from Socrates wasn't a real quotation from Socrates. It was derived from an American website that had quotations, wise quotes from philosophers. None of them are from the texts of Socrates, and as a consequence, the essay is going to get a terribly bad grade. Do look at reputable resources. When I was in London, we were told, if you haven't read the dialogue, don't give a quotation from the dialogue. So it won't be too strict, but in general, you need to know the sources, and you need to give proper references. So Google it gives a false impression that you might actually save time if you spend your time reading through an article, just for this an article or some of the notes that I give you. That will be time well spent. And then you can, if you have any questions about anything, any puzzles, you can email me. But that's the right way to approach everything. Is to in a way we sort of make everything easy for you by giving you the questions and then the texts. Of course, every degree does this, but none of it's trick photography here. It's you have the resources and you can then answer the questions. Again, do spend time writing, and as well as reading and redraft these essays. So I will leave I might in the discussion we can discuss things like the forms or anything else, or how to approach these essays. In the resources I'm going to give you will be some links to the Stanford Encyclopedia and the notes of Mark Cohen, and of course the chapter by Bertrand Russell on the value of philosophy. But other than that, I think we're almost at our time. I might just say a last word on Plato's Republic, and indeed on Socrates as well. That in the 1950s, the State Department had what they called the Great Heresy, which is was that the heresy was that the state is there for the benefit of the citizens. And this was viewed as a terrible anti-American heresy. In both Socrates and Plato, this was their idea, that the state is for the benefit of the citizens. And they also had the radical idea, which you see really spelled out in everything Socrates said, but it's also in Plato's Republic, that the people who run the state ought to know how to run the state to benefit the citizens. And again, both of these are radical views, and we can see that for all of the sort of fanciful elements that you might find in Republic, there are some things that still ring true. Right, so I shall leave you now. I can go and have a cup of coffee and see you in about 10 minutes for the tutorial. Thanks.